Well, how lucky you are then to be poised on the brink of this dive into destiny. How wonderful. And here you are, you're being invited to grapple firsthand with one of the great minds of all time in terms of Shakespeare. But you also ought to ask yourselves why. Here you are on the other side of the planet, 400 years on, and you're going to be studying a play on paper written about events 600 years ago on the other side of the planet. So what on earth is happening here? Well, I hope that what is happening is that you are actually being invited to grapple with, to engage with, to create with one of the great minds of all time. And why is Shakespeare so moving? Why does he endure? Why do people like you have to write about him? Because generations like mine tell you to. In part because he is one of the great poets of the English language. And let's remind ourselves that poetry is the best words in the best order, and that another mark of great poetry is economy, is being able to say a huge amount in a short space. And Shakespeare does this. He does it time and time again. People will argue that Shakespeare is a conservative. They'll argue that he's a radical. They'll argue that he's left. They'll argue that he's right. And they can prove these things, although they're diametrically opposed, by analysing the texts of his plays. What does this tell us? It tells us that he's a genius in presenting rounded, credible characters who believe in their own view of the world. He doesn't present us with a consistent view of the world. He presents the world as it is, varied, various, different, differing, tense, marvellous, cruel, ugly, but vital, vibrant all the time. And when we come to Henry IV, Part 1, we see Shakespeare's view of English history. Well, let's just remind ourselves, you've been looking at the context with Miss Thomas, she'll, and with other colleagues, and they will have explained this far more eloquently than I can do. But there is this talk of what is called the Shakespearean Moment, this time in history that gave birth to a glorious burst of creativity and genius in England. If you could travel back in time to London of 1597, which is when the play was written, well, what would you see? I told the other group that there's a very powerful argument raised by one person about the need to avoid time travel, and that is dentistry. You wouldn't like all that you saw in London in 1597. The pain, the squalor, some of the poverty, the dirt, the smell. You wouldn't like these things, I don't think. Well, some of you might, and then we'd worry about you. But there is all of this earthiness about London. Plague every summer. If you think we're suffering now, then they just got used to it as part of their lives, and the death count was far, far higher. But it was also a time when the world was opening up, when the Renaissance was in full flower, when ancient learning had been revisited and built upon, when the world was being explored and developed from a Western point of view, when trade was building an exchange of ideas with the East, when America was being settled and was opening up, you had a sense of expanding human possibility. And that's echoed in the language. Nobody invented more words in current usage than Shakespeare. So for Shakespeare, the language of English was a start point, but also an opportunity to develop and to grow. And all of that is key to understanding why his writing is so powerful. So, he's writing also at a dangerous time. 1597, England. It's an island on the edge of Europe. It is not a major world power. It's tangential at best. The big powers are Spain and France and the Holy Roman Empire, really. The big fight is religious. So you've got the Catholic Church in Rome adapting to the fact that England and places in Europe have drifted away, have broken away from Rome. And you've got to imagine the Catholic Church as the key multinational of its day, the monopoly of its day. Wealthy, powerful, restrictive, quixotic, corrupt in places, brilliant in places, virtuous in places. But England had stepped away from that through Henry VIII and was therefore vulnerable. On the throne in 1597 was Queen Elizabeth I. She'd been there for 39 years. She was bald, she had black teeth, but she wore a wig and heavy makeup and pretended more or less to be this young, glamorous figure around whom young men danced attention, and they played this elaborate game of beauty on the throne when everybody knew that that was not the reality. Now, why is that important? It's important because so much was invested in the monarch. And this is relevant to the play when we get there, because the play is about kingship and rule and what makes a good society. But with Elizabeth, she had decided to survive by not marrying. And because she hadn't married, of course, well, there were no children, there was no succession, and she would not announce her successor, she would not appoint her successor. So here you are in 1597, and everybody's wondering what comes next, because previous occasions when the crown has fallen vacant have been disastrous. And you get disorder, you get civil war, you get the sort of picture that opens Henry IV Part 1. But it is a crime even to talk about the death of the Queen. You can't speculate on who comes next. Everybody's wondering, nobody's talking. Except, of course, there are discussions that go on. So what you need to remember about Shakespeare's time, the time that this play was written, is that it appears to be a very confident, expansive time. But at the heart of it is uncertainty and concern. Nobody knows what's coming next. Secondly, the theatre is a very important part of life in London. Well, it's not actually in London. It's not allowed to take place in London. So the theatre is beyond the city walls. You have to cross the river, the Thames, to go to Southwark, which is where the theatres are. It's where the most interesting pubs and taverns are. It's where the brothels are. It's where the bear baiting is. It's where the sort of rougher, rumbustious side of urban life is all contained. But the theatre is there. And at a time when the minority of the people could read, when there wasn't a huge amount in terms of visual imagery, the theatre was very, very powerful. And let's also remember that the theatre invited a cross-section of society to come and see. So if you were a nobleman, you could pay top whack and you could sit on the stage and comment on the play around you as it happened. You could be seen, which is what nobles want to be. If you were from the middling classes, you might sit in a gallery. And if you were poor, you could be what was called a groundling. And you could pay a penny, I think it was, to stand in the pit of the theatre and watch. But for a very hierarchical society, in the theatres you had representatives of every class there, which is an extraordinary thing. And so the theatre became a very powerful agency for the spread of ideas, for entertainment, but also for raising difficult issues, which is what Shakespeare does when he turns to history. And one last thing, Shakespeare did live in dangerous times. You could be executed for having the wrong faith. Didn't happen a lot, but it did happen. As a playwright, you could be regarded as a subversive. And you look at the ways in which various ones of Shakespeare's contemporaries died, and they died in extremely interesting ways. And Shakespeare himself came close to imprisonment in 1601. So what happened then? The Earl of Essex, who was a favourite of Elizabeth I, young, dashing, energetic, a bit of a failure, but let's not hold that against him, was desperate and decided to raise a rebellion. He decided to have a strike for the crown himself. So he organised a revolt. And the signal for the revolt to all of his supporters was to hire Shakespeare's company to revive a Shakespeare play. And the Shakespeare play that was put on in 1601 as a trigger for the rebellion was Richard II. Richard II describes the usurpation, the removal of an ineffective king, an ineffective monarch. And that's why it was used as the trigger for Essex's rebellion. Now, Essex's rebellion failed. He was executed. He walked to his block wearing a black cloak, and at the last moment, before he knelt, took off his cloak, and there was revealed his crimson silk doublet. His death was an act of theatre. He had launched his rebellion with an act of theatre. The visual gesture mattered a huge amount. But Shakespeare was almost imprisoned because he was deemed to be implicit, if not complicit, in that rebellion. And that was not something that was looked upon kindly by the authorities of the day. So the theatre mattered. The theatre mattered. And then we look at Henry IV, Part 1. Again, one of the key things to remember about Henry IV, Part 1 is that it is not about Henry IV, really. It's about Hal. Of course, the two are interlinked, and of course, Henry IV himself is key. But with Hal, you know what you're getting as an Englishman in the 16th century. It's as if there was a play written about Bradman here, or Monash, a massive national hero. When you tackle a massive national hero, you're not going to be writing a different ending. You're not going to say that Bradman actually finished with an average of 150 when he I think it was 99.8, was it? You can't mess with the key facts. You can't say that Monash won the Second World War when he was implicit in the First. But you can put different spins upon the stories of key figures. Now, for England in Shakespeare's day, Prince Hal, Henry V, was the hero king. So the Hal you're dealing with, Prince Hal, Prince of Wales, becomes Henry V. And Henry V is the archetypal English warrior king. He has the good fortune to die young and undefeated. So the audience would know that. The audience would know that the figure you see as Hal, and you encounter him at first in very unpromising circumstances. I mean, he doesn't look like a hero in the making, but we know that he'll emerge as this Superman, ultimately, and that therefore all that we're seeing might be shocking and disturbing and interesting, but it will turn out well. So why did Shakespeare turn to history as a part of his creative mission? Partly he wanted to be able to explore his current situation through the mirror of the past. Partly everybody was concerned about the future of the kingdom because it was held that the king was, or the queen was selected by God. The divine providence and right of kings and queens was a key part of the belief. So first of all, everybody was wondering, who has God chosen to succeed Elizabeth? And secondly, there's a problem with the divine right theory. Well, there are a number But one of the key questions is, what do you do about a bad king, an incompetent king? If the king or queen is selected by God, what can you do when you get a bad one? I mean, the question of why God should give you a bad king is another one. We won't even go there. But the question is then, what do you do if the kingdom is about to fall apart? And Henry IV is about a kingdom falling apart. It is a nightmare for people of Shakespeare's day. They think it might be coming to them. The solidity of the crown and the permanence of the government are inextricably linked, and all of this seems to be at peril because nobody knows what's coming next. So you look at history, and Henry IV himself, Hal's father, is what is called a usurper. What is a usurper? Does anybody know? Yes?
Someone who masters the throne.
Yes. Good, thank you. Somebody who's taken the throne without right, really. Somebody who's taken the throne by force. So Henry IV is a usurper. The other key usurper, just to note, is Henry VII. Does anybody know who he was? Well, Henry VII was the founder of the House of Tudor and Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, but he had taken the throne from Richard III and was therefore king by conquest, not necessarily by right. But it wouldn't do to examine Henry VII as a usurper, because that could be seen to be a criticism of Elizabeth and the House of Tudor, and that's a dangerous thing to do. So you go back to the previous usurper, and that is Henry IV. He took the throne from Richard II. Shakespeare's play Richard II, which was used by Essex as the trigger for his rebellion, and which talks about what you do when you've got an ineffectual king. But the fact is that you've got to square the idea that Henry IV went against God's will by taking Richard II out. And what then happens? Well, you can argue that the whole of Henry IV Part 1 is about the punishment of Henry IV for his usurpation. He does not become a happy king. He is presented with a disintegrating, deteriorating political situation. He is misled, he is betrayed. He's betrayed by his son, he's betrayed by his nobles, and it's a miserable, miserable life. It's all preparatory for Henry V, but in a way the poison of usurpation has to be swept away from the system so that the state can be healthy again. And Henry V, this figure who will emerge, is shown to us as a playboy, as somebody who has no moral compass, as someone who sides with injustice, who breaks the law, who upsets his father to the point that his father wants to reject him and would prefer to have another son called Hotspur. You've come across him already, I think. Well, what is this all about? Can I just alert you to what I think is the key speech in the whole play? My colleagues may disagree. It's in Act 2, Scene 4, where Shakespeare gives Hal 8 words. So if you can sum up the play in 8 words, you're doing really well. So you take nothing out of this hall this morning, apart from this, please take this. And they're simple words. They are, I do, I will, I know you all. I do, I will, I know you all. Monosyllabic, simple, easy to remember. If you're going to make a list of key quotations to remember, it should be number 1. Why is it so important? Well, first of all, it's Hal opening up to you. He's telling you what he's doing and why he's doing it. Secondly, he is full of drive. I do. It's about me. I know what I'm doing. I know what I will do. I know what I will do. I know you all. And what it's telling you in that last line is that the whole reason in Hal's mind for his hiding in this disguise of disorder is to get to know the kingdom that he will rule, to understand it, to bring it all into unity, to see the world beyond the court and the battlefield. And therefore, all of the anguish that he's causing his father is part of his emerging statecraft. This is what makes him a super king. He understands his kingdom and his people, and he can bring them all together. So, with history, there is a defined outcome. You can't reverse those. With a national icon, there is a set of resonances. You can't unpick all of those. The audience joins the playwright in a sort of conspiracy. The people who are fooled are the other characters in the play. The audience knows that Hal is okay and will be okay. They wonder how he's going to get there. That's the dramatic tension. But there's no doubt that this will head towards the realization of a national dream. So you've got the facts of history, and Shakespeare adds in there some invention. And the invention is the world of Falstaff and all of that view of the lower echelons of society. And most of history is about the noble figures, particularly history of the Middle Ages. You don't get a focus upon the poor. You tend not to get a focus upon women. But it's all about the nobles and the men. So you have this idea of the court, which is all of the nobles, and they are noble in name, but not particularly noble in action. Somebody has described them as a wolf pack of ravenous greed. To understand this idea of inversion, this idea of turning the world upside down. Order is about steadiness, peace, tranquility, trade, confidence. Disorder is about ambition, violence, lawlessness, and chaos. And we have to be clear that for the Elizabethan audience, the idea of chaos was very real and very, very frightening. They had order of a sort under Elizabeth, pretty good order, really. And what they were worried about what was to come next. You've got the tension, therefore, between the court and the country. In the play, you've also got the tension between those who believe in calculation and those who believe in chaos. So, calculation, how are we going to make this work for us, versus those who want to profit from disorder. In fact, the two are very closely linked, because some people calculate that chaos brings them benefit. Hal is the ultimate calculator. Again, as you're working through this play, a very good exercise is to sit down and identify all of his soliloquies. Now let's remember that the conspiracy here is between Hal and the audience. The other characters on the stage don't know what Hal is thinking. We do, and he does, obviously. History does. So if you can isolate each of his soliloquies, just write them out, get to know them, it won't take long. Then you can plot throughout the play the way in which his thinking is revealed. He's actually constant all the way through, but he lets others know, drip by drip, word by word, line by line. So do pay attention to his soliloquies. They're sort of thought bubbles. There's tension between calculation and chaos. There's tension between vice and virtue. What is the right thing to do? What is the selfish thing to do? How do we strike a balance between the two? You need to get to that point of dynamic equilibrium in politics. You've got the contrast between Falstaff and Hotspur, the two alternative figures, if you like, of Hal's world. Falstaff, the deceptive, attractive source of support, which will lead nowhere, and Hotspur, the rival, who is ultimately unfit for kingship. but whom people think is preferable at being a place with power. You've got the tension between appetite and duty. Falstaff and the nobles are all about appetite, doing what they want to do when they want to do it. Hal appears to be about appetite, but is far more calculating than that. And duty is about order. We take order for granted. Elizabethan people did not. They could look across the continent of Europe and see horrific warfare. They could see what happened when states collapsed. They could see what would happen with weak rule. And they really were frightened of that in a very strong way. There's a contrast between the court and the country. The court is this world where the nobles exist amongst themselves, and the country is obviously a much broader canvas with a much greater variety of lifestyle. And when this phrase, the body politic, is talked about, that sees the whole country as a body, where the court is at the heart and the country is the limbs, but the whole thing needs to be in good health and collaborating with each other to be effective. What happens when the body politic is diseased is, of course, really very hard in terms of illness and in terms of cure. You've got the tension between fiction and fact. You've got the idea that people jump to conclusions very simply and very quickly. They jump to conclusions about how and his intent. They jump to conclusions about Hotspur and his potential. They jump to conclusions about the law and about stories and about allegations without proof. And there's tension between unity and disunity. There's one key scene in the play involving a map. It's in Act 3, Scene 1, around about line 66. But it's a visual representation of the kingdom being torn apart. So have a look at that, because it is a very important representation. So, ultimately then, we come back to the view that you're confronted with a very brief but very complicated text. Your teachers will work through that with you, but can I encourage you to really get to know it well? Your teachers are all the better equipped to look at this work with you if you put in a little bit of the initial effort. It doesn't take long to read. I can think of no greater pleasure in life than sitting down with a pot of tea and Shakespeare play, possibly some chocolate biscuits too. I know you share that view. Far better than clubbing, much cheaper, and possibly more efficacious. But if you can do that, look at these things, please. First of all, remember the movement, the dramatic movement from order to disorder. Disorder to order. Secondly, look at the shape of words on the page. Thirdly, isolate cowls, soliloquies. Fourthly, think about a list of the key scenes. And fifthly, remember that Shakespeare uses simple language when he wants you to remember it. I do, I will, I know you all is really key. Hal is preparing himself for emergence as a superhero through putting in the work to get to know his kingdom. What appears to be indulgence and selfishness might have elements of that in it. But in fact, what he's doing is understanding the challenges that lie ahead. Shakespeare is saying that kingship can be learned if you have the drive, if you have the will. Is based upon his understanding with, his union with, his appreciation of all of his kingdom, whether that be Wales and its magicality, whether it be the world of the tavern and its rough and ready enjoyment questions and other things, you need to ensure that you understand the text and you've got it under your control. Happy to take questions. Go ahead. There is a speech. Perhaps you want to go. They don't want to go. So, I'm sure they're spellbound. They're feeling the love, the magic. So, let's just. I will read a speech to you from Act 1, Scene 2. I know you all, and will a while uphold the unyoked humour of your idleness. Yet herein will I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world. That when he please again to be himself, being wanted, he may be more wondered at by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapours that we seem to strangle. So, when this loose behaviour I throw off and pay the debt I never promised, by how much better than my word I am, by so much shall I falsify men's hopes, and like bright metal on a sullen ground, my reformation, glittering all my fault, shall show more goodly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set it on. I'll so offend, make offence a skill, redeeming time when men think least I will. So what he says is I have to prepare myself to look as bad as I can, so that when I step forward from this cloud, like the sun behind a dark cloud, the sunburst will be dazzling, and I will be even more